And then while my co-author introduces herself, then I'll do the logistics around the screen sharing. But I do want to say thank you. It's through efforts like this and funding that allows many of us to share our knowledge more broadly. Without the stipend, I would have struggled to make that financial to make the finances work in order to travel to Ireland, which is not a little cost. So I am forever grateful for that and for the work that MNORN does to continue to support others in pursuing these types of events. So my name is Stephanie Gingrich, and I am a specialty coordinator at the University of Minnesota School of Nursing, and I lead the doctoral program in health innovation and leadership. And I do see a couple of my students here, so it's really great to see faces out in the community as well. The program really is geared towards ensuring that leaders are able to be prepared to address their areas of interest, really changing healthcare systems in a way that's meaningful to them. So we don't have one cookie cutter type of leader, but rather our leaders really go out and change a vast array of areas within healthcare. In addition to that role, I teach within the program, and I'm also the incoming director for global programming, looking at the different international relationships that we have around the world in order to enhance the doctoral experience, but also exchange that knowledge back and forth so that we can continue to improve the health of people around the world. So that's just a little bit about myself. For those of you who know me personally, you know I don't sit still. So for me, this was a lot of fun, and I am bilingual. I will add that too. So some of the things that you'll hear about tonight, I will say one of the privileges that I have is coming from a background as a bilingual speaker and a bicultural individual. So I'm privileged with that and grateful for those experiences that my mother bestowed on me. And with that, I will pass it on to Marty while I get technology up and running.
Well, hello everyone. This is so fun, majorly fun for me to see so many familiar faces and familiar names. I love you all. So I'm Marty Lewis Hunstiger. I am a retired pediatric nurse and preceptor. I am the founding managing editor of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, which is the journal that we're going to be talking mostly about tonight. And I was the editor-in-chief of another scholarly journal, which is called Creative Nursing, for 15 years. And I'll be sharing some examples from that journal in this presentation too. I'm also an affiliate faculty member at the University of Minnesota, and my activities there these years have been one, contributing to the journal, the partnership journal, and then also I'm involved in the interprofessional curriculum. It used to be called Foundations of Interprofessional Communication and Collaboration. These days it's called Better Together, but anyway, I represent the School of Nursing in those activities. While she's still doing tech stuff, I'll just tell you about the Ireland conference. So our professional organization of nursing editors is called the International Academy of Nursing Editors, and our acronym is INANE, which is a little editing joke. You know, people will say, "Now, do you know?" And we say, "Yes, we know, we're editors." And we meet annually, and occasionally it's virtually, other years it's in person, and once in a while it's out of the country. And this past year it was in Ireland. And so I had the joy of sharing that with Stephanie and also with my daughter, who among other things is a nurse too. So there you go. You're muted, Stephanie.
Thank you. It sounds like you're able to see our slides. And so I will begin with just a brief overview of what this project is, and then we'll go deeper into the work in just a moment. So Marty and I both work in the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies and hold a role within that journal, which is an international journal where you can publish and have access to the content without having to pay a fee. You can access the articles without having to pay a fee. So really trying to make that knowledge accessible worldwide. And so this presentation really is, you know, as you're publishing, most often you'll see that articles are published in a singular language. And so part of the question that we had is what if we do it a little differently than that? So our objectives tonight are, hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand some of the challenges and strengths associated with publishing a multilingual article in both Spanish and English. And while you may not be working within a journal and publishing articles, perhaps you can learn from some of the translational methods that we'll describe and be able to apply that into your own settings or rethink the way that language is being disseminated or knowledge is being disseminated in your own settings. We also hope that you might be able to identify processes within your own settings that can be reimagined really with that lens of partnership and discourse, and we'll describe both of those as well. So you can't go into a project truly without saying thank you to those who laid that foundation for you to be there. And this project would not have existed without the decade-long work from the Cuban researchers looking at the influence of the media, family, and education on the way that children identify their own gender. And so this is really due to the research that these Cuban researchers accomplished over that time, and to our team of incredible people who were able to offer their time and energy to make this publication even an option. So the article, as I described, the scholars, the researchers are from the University of Havana in Cuba, representing a multitude of areas. So it wasn't just one area, but their researchers were from health science, the communication science, as well as sociology and social work. And they were really looking at what are the influence of primary schools, the family, and the media on how children identified their gender. And so as they recognize within Hispanic culture, there is a lot of machismo culture. It's very dominated between male and female. If you're female, you're female. If you're male, you're male. And so what they were looking at is what then does that mean in how children identify as their gender as they grow up. And so I'll hand it over to Marty to talk through these first two sections that are really important to understand really the impetus for the work.
Okay, so we start with what is the purpose of scholarly publishing? Why do we do it? And I'll give you my answer to that right up front. If you're doing some good nursing, we need to get the word out about it to the audience of people who can learn from it, implement it, and then help you make it even better. So that's the purpose of scholarly publishing. So the question is, what does the term scholarly publishing really mean? I'll say a little about it first, but then we would like to take a couple minutes to find out what it means to you. We could get all dialectical on our heinies and say scholarly publishing as opposed to what? So as opposed to unscholarly or non-scholarly publishing. So a more reasonable distinction would be scholarly publishing as opposed to publishing for a general audience, which is sometimes called the popular press. And being able to write for the general public about nursing and health is crucial. It's a really important skill, but that's usually categorized differently than scholarly writing just because it's such a different audience. So is scholarly publishing presenting information that's evidence-based and that's founded on and expanding on an already existing body of research, as opposed to, as my friend and colleague Adisham Yunus, who's the new editor-in-chief of Creative Nursing, the way he describes grounded theory, this is something I came up with sitting in a lawn chair in my backyard with a drink in my hand. So hopefully scholarly publishing is not that. It's something that's grounded on existing research and so forth. So when you hear this term, we would like to know, Steph and I would like to know, what associations do you make when you hear the term scholarly publishing? What comes to your mind? So let's take a couple of minutes and you can either put it in the chat, raise your hand, or just unmute and speak up. Let's allot 2 minutes for people to say, when somebody says to you scholarly publishing or scholarly writing, what do you think about? Hildy says evidence-based. Rigorous, peer-reviewed, follows a prescribed format. Generating new knowledge. Oh, these are wonderful. For further research or practice implementation. Evidence-informed. Now, these are all so far ones that they really will support what it is that we've been trying to do. Because if you ask a lot of people, this is not this sample, these people who are on this Zoom call are not even your average nurses, I think, because a lot of nurses and healthcare professionals, if you say scholarly publishing, the first thing that they might say is academia. They link it with academia. Here again, Jan, meaningful for nursing practice. All of the things that people have described, if they're listed in the chat now. Oh, okay, ivory tower. that's more the stereotypical thinking of when you say scholarly publishing. That's what people think of. And for both journals that I work on, that is the concern. So I'd like to address that because for a fair number of people, scholarly publishing means articles that come from academia, from the ivory tower. The implication of that is if you aren't either a faculty member or a student of a school of nursing or another healthcare professional education program, anything you write isn't of value to the wider world. And I'll go further. That might even say anything that comes from a health profession school that grants less than a baccalaureate degree, and even better, an advanced degree, or God forbid, is for profit, dun, 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 isn't of value to the wider world. And I'm proud to say that's not our view at either of the journals I work with. Not only do we welcome articles from all levels and all kinds of health education professions, but also we welcome submissions from health professionals who don't have connections to academia, but who are providing humane, insightful, direct care, and they have wonderful ideas about it that everybody needs to hear about. So for the purposes of this presentation, scholarly publishing is the process of taking those wonderful ideas, wherever they're coming from, supporting the people who are doing that work in writing those ideas down, having the ideas examined closely by content experts about them who can identify any places where the information is incorrect, incomplete, or unclear, then formatting and editing the information to be the most understandable to readers, and then disseminating them. This is important too, disseminating them in established ongoing sources, which are usually journals, but they can be other things too. It doesn't have to be only journals, that will tell readers clearly who wrote this stuff, where they got their information, and how to get a hold of them for further information for discourse about what they wrote, and then we'll archive the material. So that is what we mean by scholarly publishing. And so you'll notice that it doesn't have to take place in academia. Some does, and that's great. Academia has certain resources to help with this process, but it does not have to take place in the framework of academia. So as far as the culture of English, scholarly publishing is changing really fast, partly because technology itself is publishing. Creative nursing, I should say the partnership journal has always been online only. Creative nursing for many years was a print publication, and then it had PDFs that were online somewhere. We are now, as of 2 years ago, only online, and that really is the future. for many reasons. So scholarly publishing is changing fast, but also the structures that evolved are being challenged. One of the structures that evolved was that English became the default language for scholarly publishing. There have always been scholarly articles and whole journals published in other languages, but the dominant legacy language, the language with the most social capital, has been English. Now, there are situations where a universal language is preferable. For example, the international language of aviation, air traffic control and aviation safety, is English. And there are probably several reasons for this besides the power structure that makes English so powerful. For one thing, English has some real advantages, except for some pronouns and some names of roles or job descriptions or occupations. English is pretty much gender neutral, which is a real advantage. And then and it's also, the grammar is simpler than in some other languages. But in other ways, English is not the greatest language. Since it's one of the newest languages and it's a hybrid of several different kinds or sources, the pronunciation is very idiosyncratic, and spelling as well. So anyway, English has worked okay for scholarly publishing for the people who can speak it and write it. But the domination, the hegemony of English has meant that in scholarly discourse about health, whole cultures and civilizations have been marginalized. Later, I'm going to show you some examples in Chinese, Persian, and Arabic. And Stephanie's going to tell you about this article from Cuba. Now, Cuba is a place where, in my opinion, because of decades of propaganda from the American popular media, lots of people think healthcare in Cuba must be very primitive. In fact, despite all the challenges they've had with a blockade of supplies and communication, they are light years ahead of us in community health and disease prevention, which is always better than treatment.
Thank you for that, Marty. The other things that, as we were going through this work, that we were considering and held as part of our principles and part of the work throughout this process was the history of how this article came to be. We know that there is a historical difference between the United States and Cuba, and I'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But there is this way that we were able to develop this relationship and how that evolved in order to allow this article even to be at this phase. The other thing that we also kept forefront is what are the existing models of translation, and what is the way that are the recommended way in order to make sure that the integrity of the message is retained when you are going from one language into another, because it's not just a direct translation, but rather there's these influences that may not be visible to that direct translation that are behind the scenes, the culture, all of the pieces that go around the way that the words are structured and the way they're organized in the actual language. So those are things that we also kept forefront in the work that we were doing. And then, as a journal, just stepping back for a moment, there is this idea that as Marty was talking about, that English is the default language. And I see, Rachel, that you're commenting, you feel bad about excluding the articles because they're not in English. And, in some ways, there is the resource that whether or not you're fluent in a language, of whether that's something you can even access that knowledge if it's in another language, right? What resources do you naturally have? But there's also this persistence that occurs in certain settings where English is just better. Whether you have the resource to try it in another language, or is it that system that's telling you don't even bother? And that's some of the experience that I came from. Is in my introduction, I told you I'm bilingual, I'm bicultural. And when I was in nursing school, one of the experiences that I had after being raised by a very strong woman who spoke Spanish her whole life, and then immigrated to the United States with a valid visa, everything is legal. came to the United States, and her Spanish was consistently looked down upon because, or rather her English was looked down upon because she had this Spanish accent. And then I go into nursing school, and I was told during one of my assignments by one of my professors to do a lit review, but go ahead and filter out any other language or research articles that are completed in other countries, because the only ones that are valid enough to do the assignment are those that are in English and completed here in the United States. And I just paused, right? Like, what is this? This is not that long ago. And I just paused in that moment and I said, we've got to do better. We absolutely have to do better, because in that moment, what that individual didn't realize is that my uncle in Panama was one of 3 nephrologists really paving the way for kidney care. And automatically that knowledge was being set aside and said that's not important enough. And yet he had completely made a profession on that. So this is how I went through my early nursing career, is really challenging the why do we think this way and we can do differently. Marty?
So there are reasonable concerns about publishing in multiple languages. It's not xenophobic or colonialist or supremacist to have concerns. I mean, some things about publishing in multiple languages are issues. They may even be obstacles or barriers, but they do not have to be deal breakers, the way she's describing. Now, for example, the question of relevance. One might ask, can an article from a country that has a consolidated government-run healthcare system be understandable to readers from a country where the market determines access to care? We run into this all the time in both journals. What about an article from a country where traditional non-Western treatment modalities are given equal respect? Is that article relevant for us? Or, on the other hand, what about articles from a country where the dominant culture rejects science and other aspects of modernity? Do readers have anything to learn from those articles, or should we just not regard them at all? As far as valid references, scholarly articles have references. And so I look at this article that comes from another country. In creative nursing, we publish in English. So any article that we publish has to have been translated into English. But you look at the reference list, and these references will be from journals that are not in English. How do I know that they're legit? Not from predatory publishers. This is a valid concern that's not limited to other countries. But are these sources likely to be unreliable? Are they the product of subpar editing more than legacy sources in English? And I'm just going to throw out one. You've heard of the Lancet? Has everybody heard of the Lancet? Okay, this is a journal that's been around since 1823. It's considered probably the premier legacy. If anybody's going to be right, it'll be the Lancet. The Lancet published the bogus paper that linked vaccinations and autism. This paper, from the very first copy edit, was a ethically flawed paper. It had cherry-picked subjects, and it had bogus financing. The financing was lied about. And as soon as it was published, content experts started protesting about it. It still took the Lancet 12 years to retract it. So it's not that we should be careful about sources from other countries. We just have to remember that maybe the ones we think are so great aren't really so great. As far as fluency, I'll just say briefly, both the journals I work with get submissions that have major issues with English fluency. And the question isn't so much, can this article be made understandable to most readers? Because most articles can if you do enough copy editing and you work back and forth. But it takes resources. Do we have the resources to make it intelligible? The article that we're talking about now, the primary author, New Yorker Gonzalez Escalona, is fluent in English. And with the help of the translators that were listed on that first, especially Doug, Bruce, and Stephanie's mom, Lillian, what came to me to be copy edited was in wonderful shape. But it takes resources to do that. And cost is kind of into that too, is do we have the resources to make these things fluent?
So with that, given all of that information, as we were faced with this question of the article, we were looking at a goal of how is it that we can challenge this idea that English is the way that we should put everything into in order to publish, but rather consider, can we publish in the languages in which the scholars are actually writing? Because if they're generating this information in their language, this is probably pretty vital to their communities, and so it should be retained within their language, as well as sharing it to the larger community where we know IJPS and our readers are English speaking or have accessed the knowledge in English, and so offering it in both ways, but really starting off with, can we publish things in the way that the scholars are actually writing them? So with this particular work, our vision was to look at the models for translation, and I'll explain what these terms mean in translation and retro translation, while looking at the self work, so reflecting on what are our biases, what are our stereotypes, what are the cultural differences and perhaps the dialects that would influence that translation process, and then looking at the importance of teamwork, respect, collaboration, these meaningful discussions where we can challenge each other when these biases emerge. And so our vision was to capture all of that and put it into a model so that others who were interested in doing this type of work perhaps would have a guideline that they could follow in that. And so the article, right? So this particular article, knowing all of the things that we've kind of talked about as the background, the foreground, all of the things, how did this article actually come to being? Part of it is the relationships that we have with Cuba. And so when our government was allowed us to travel to Cuba, Dr. Teddy Potter developed a relationship with scholars and a particular program in Cuba to allow for the travel to Cuba for students to learn about the national prevention-based healthcare model. And several who are on this call have been on trips to Cuba to learn from their healthcare system with the intention to come back, really look at our systems and learn and grow and continue that relationship back and forth. So the relationships that we have started with those initial conversations and trips, and through that the discussions began that these Cuban scholars, part of our groups that we went to visit, were actually working on machismo as a public health issue and very concerned about the influence that machismo is having within their culture on their youth. And so they had been working on this research for about a decade. When the article came to us, IJPS really looked at it initially with the question of, do we have the resources to take this article and translate it into English in order to publish it? So take a pause for a moment, right? These researchers are writing this article because their culture has a public health issue in machismo, and we want to take their article and strip it of its original language and put it into English. And in some countries that may be a viable option because the culture has people who may have that English as another language. This is not necessarily the case in Cuba. It's not necessarily the case in other countries. And so really, we took a step back and we said, is this the right thing to do, or can we do better? And what if? What if we did it differently? And so then we started exploring, what if we actually publish this as a multilingual article where we publish it in the original as well as in the English to support our readers who have come frequently for our articles in English, with the concerns of how do we do this respectfully, considering the cultural norms. Spanish is a gendered-based language. A table has a gender. In English, we are not a gendered-based language. Table is an it, right? And so how do you navigate those nuances? And then even within that, the dialects, and within Spanish, dialects are very different across the world. And so my Panamanian dialect is very different at times than Cuban dialect. We can converse, but there are times when those words don't quite align. And so that was something that we wanted to make sure we were doing well. And also making sure that we had scholars who could navigate both of the languages, because what we learned is through the translation method, there's so many ways, you have no idea, there's so many ways that you could do translation, but there's a lot of things that you need to consider about. So you can take an article and say, here's the masterpiece. We're not going to change anything to that. We are going to mirror this in another language and just move forward, right? So the forward translation. Retro translation is, you know what, we have this original piece, we want it to go to this piece, but we want them to mirror each other. And so we're taking that original, going to that translation, someone's translating it, but a different individual, to ensure that that translation is accurate, then takes that translation and translates it back to the first language. And that's when you can compare and say, do we actually have a product that makes the most sense with that original intent? Other things in the literature that are addressed is, who are the individuals doing the translators, and what are their primary languages? We know that if English is your dominant language, you should not then be taking your dominant language and translating into your non-dominant language, because that's not where you're most fluent. And so looking at the direction that the translators are going. We're also looking at content experts to make sure that we're not misinterpreting the research itself, and making sure that during that translational process, we still maintain the integrity of the research. The context itself within language, validation, some translational methods are looking at validating specific tools if they're translating for tools. And again, that language direction, like I talked about. So these were some of the things that we learned about the proper way to do things. Now, of course, our resources are different, so this is what we did. And I laugh because you can never just take a model, right, and follow it directly. Your resources typically, when you're looking at a quality improvement project, it's not research, so it's adapted to your setting and your resources, and that's what this was. And so we had a modified version of back translation, where we took that first Spanish article, we translated it into English, and we compared that English article to the Spanish. And then we said, oh, you know what, there's some things that we did wrong, but we never had different people doing the work because we didn't have those types of resources, but rather everybody was involved in it. And as we worked through the process, we developed these iterations of the English, comparing it back to the Spanish. And then as we got further in the process, we wanted to make sure that we also captured the copy editing as well as the peer review process in both languages, because you don't want to copy edit and peer review only one article. Remember, we're doing a multilingual publication. And so we had to copy edit and peer review in both. And so that's where this modified version emerged. Within this, however, we also wanted to make sure that all of this is done with the themes of partnership based on Rian Eisler's model for partnership, which says that there's high respect for all of those involved. There's low degree of abuse of violence, right? We didn't want to intimidate or marginalize individuals or make anybody feel less empowered to speak up. And so really there's this flattened hierarchy. Everything we did was in relationship with each other and deep respect for everyone's presence on the team, and through discourse. And so with the discourse, I'll highlight here, there's this word comes sometimes with some varied opinions around it, but discourse in this setting, really what we're talking about is that safety through partnership approaches, that safety to engage and say, hey, you know what, you did something that you're letting your bias or your stereotype influence the way that we're translating this work, and we need to check that. And having that ability to do that throughout this process to maintain the integrity of the work, but also maintain the respect and relationships that we had. So that discourse for us really was an intentional openness to engage in conversation and check each other throughout that process. So the things that we did have to walk through with this article is, like I mentioned, most of the nouns are gendered in Spanish, and the default is actually male. And so when you're looking at, especially in our society here in the United States, where we're very aware of genders and this feminist culture that is we're very aware of pronouns and making sure that we highlight and empower women. The last thing we wanted to do was perpetuate machismo, right, in an English version. However, the integrity of the document in Spanish, they say boys and girls. And in English, one of the examples that we had was that one of our copy editors switched that wording around because of the bias that we hold, right? Our own influence was like, we're not going to put boys first. We're going to make it girls and boys. But that's not the way that the Spanish language works. And so we had to be aware of what our influence was on the piece and ensure that we removed that in order to be really honoring that original intent. So that's one example of how gender came into play. Another one is that in the cultural setting in Spanish, there is an honor towards that patriarchy, even though it's opposite of what we want to instill within partnership, but rather it's a very deep-rooted cultural aspect in Cuba and many Hispanic cultures. The multi-generational homes, not something we experience here in the United States, but it was threaded throughout that work. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know we have a few more slides to go through, but I'll make sure that Kathy has these that you can access as well. So there were many aspects from the article that we worked through to ensure that integrity. Through the work and through what I was talking about earlier about the models, what we identified is there really isn't a model in publication or in translation methods that says, hey, we need to assess our own bias, our own stereotypes within ourselves as well as the team before you dive into this translational process to develop this product and engage in discourse as you work through translation from an original language to a translated language with the intention of developing a product that has the core meaning, all based in partnership. And for that reason, our team pulled together this model to support, and we're publishing it to support others who want to pursue multilingual publications as well. And we shared this within our presentation at MNORN, and many of the publishers were just very excited to have this type of work available to them and interested in our process and that deep dive in self-reflection and team reflection of bias in order to retain and respect the original intent and still do the copy editing as well as the peer review for publication.
So this is a verbal depiction of the graphic that you saw on the previous slide. And I won't read through it, but what I want to call out is the last line, which says the foundation, because the whole model was based on partnership. And as she described, partnership for us has a specific meaning. It isn't just like, business partners or, oh, you're my partner or my romantic partner or my whatever partner. Partnership for our journal is based on Riane Eisler's scholarship, cultural transformation theory on domination and partnership cultures, that societies orient on a continuum between domination and partnership. And partnership cultures are characterized by such things as flattened hierarchies, and respect. And that is what we really wanted to call out. For us, for me, and for me personally, one of the things that was so important is that we need to show our understanding with every breath we take, that while a certain language may be the best language for a particular situation like air travel, there is nothing about any language that makes it less scholarly or less worthy of our respect and attention. So I am going to suggest that we mostly skip this. The copy editing is the phase in any publication where you take the article that the author has said, this is the best I can do, and then a copy editor who has hopefully a really objective view looks at it and says, is this accurate, clear, and complete? And at that point, the copy editor is an advocate for the readers. So I put the sequence here, but if you want to go on to the next slide, Stephanie, because I don't speak Spanish. So when I was copy editing this article, even though I don't speak Spanish, I could copy edit. For one thing, there are many cognates. There are many words that are similar in both languages. So for instance, that whole thing about boys and girls or girls and boys, I was able to tell whether it said boys and girls or girls and boys, and whatever we decided we wanted to do, I could make that happen. In Cuba, the default is male, and so we just had to work with that. And that wasn't my call, that was a group call. Another thing about scholarly publishing, when you're talking about study findings in your review of literature, study findings are presented in the past tense. And even though I don't speak Spanish, I was able to tell the places where in Spanish it wasn't past tense. Sometimes the author would mention a source and what they found, which needed to be in the past tense. And then the authors would kind of ruminate about that, which could be in the present tense. And then they would go back to the past tense again. And I was able to copy edit that just because you picked that up a little bit. But the other point that we want to make is that AI, people think AI is so wonderful, and it is wonderful, but technology still needs people. And I'm giving you an example about this. It's kind of complicated, but please stay with me because it'll show you what I mean. So in the English version that I received, there was a table that had a place where it said the majority of respondents did this. Well, in order to be scholarly rigorous, we should have had a number, 59% or 76% of the respondents said that, not just a majority. And so I called that out. I said, we really need a number. And it turned out that in the process of gathering the data, that number was not available. That small data point was not gathered. Okay, so this happens all the time in scholarly publishing. And the way that it's addressed is just to state, this statistic is not available. There's full disclosure, full transparency, and any reader can look at that and see how this lack of this one small number does not affect the validity of what the authors are trying to say. That's how it's dealt with. So in the English version, we inserted this little phrase. It didn't even have to be a complete sentence because it was a table. It said, quantitative percentage not available. And that takes care of the scholarly rigor. But then when I was doing the Spanish version, I could tell that that little phrase did not get inserted into the Spanish version. And so I looked back and I found my sequence of emails. And the subject line of this email was, OMG, one tiny detail, and then we're done. Because I had found that. And so I said, I'm suggesting that we just stick in a direct quote, quantitative percentage not available. I stuck it in there just to see how it looked in the Spanish version. So I said, I put it in English. Whoever does this final version needs to take it out. And I think that it might be, esa información no derivo de encuesta. That was just kind of pulling it out of my butt. I said, that may or may not be the correct way to say it in Spanish, but somebody needs to put it in Spanish. Someone else may have a different solution. So we added it. And this level of detail is what has enabled us to say about this publication process. It had the same degree of scholarly rigor in both languages. And these are things that large language models and AI bots just can't do 100%. They can help us a lot. We can say to a bot, make sure that all of the review of literature is in the past tense. And they can do that, and it'll save us time and energy. That's great. But an AI bot won't pick up when a report of a study is in the past tense, but then the author's ruminating about it, and that can be present, and then it goes back. A bot just cannot do that. Maybe at some point they will. Also, an AI bot would not have picked up the fact that that one little line needed to be added in English, let alone in Spanish. Quantitative percentage not available. You know, I wasn't the only one doing this. Everybody on that list was involved in doing this level of detail. Bots can't do that. It takes and also a bot couldn't have then respectfully dealt with the authors to correct this small detail. That takes a human.
So why did we do this, right? And you heard earlier, I don't sit still. So part of it was just, it was a challenge and it was very fun. Part of it was we got to challenge a norm that needed to be challenged, challenging English as the scholarly language. As of July 2023, this article has been viewed 542 times and downloaded 234 times, which is great. Maybe a little different than our social media views. We get that. But in scholarly readings and articles, this is actually a pretty decent amount, pretty impressive. We were also able to support and mentor authors along the way, and again, demonstrate in practice, what does partnership principles look like? Another joy is that Niurka, who is here in this image, I was able to connect with her, meet her last year in person for the first time after this whole process, and just meet her, connect with her, and share with her that her article was published in both English and Spanish. Again, she had been there with the whole process, but we were able to connect as colleagues, and knowing that her knowledge is out there in the world, not only for those communities who speak Spanish, but also communities who are looking to address machismo in their cultures in English, was really, really meaningful to her.
I mentioned before that the domination of English has meant that in scholarly publishing about health, scholarly discourse about health, whole cultures and civilizations have been marginalized. And we've shown you how at IJPS we did this. We're working to disrupt that, and because we hope to do more of these. I want to quickly show you some examples from creative nursing. I'm aware that it's already 7:53. We were going to allow a lot more time for Q&A, and so I don't know if you have a hard stop at 8, but I'm going to tell you about this stuff anyway. So I have two examples from.
People can stay on as long as they want to, Marty.
Oh,
so
all right, that's good to know. All right, so we have recently published 2 articles. Our new publisher, Sage, is very supportive of publishing in multiple languages. And so I have 3 articles to show you. One is by Shui Bai from China, who used a mind map on a neurology unit in China during the pandemic. Another one is by Mariam Esmaili and Parvina Asghari. They are continuing colleagues of ours at the Journal. And they had an education program, a support program for families in Iran who are taking their loved ones home on trach vent. And then Yunus et al., this is an article that's not from Creative Nursing, but it shows what you can do with narrative data in other languages. So if you can do the next slide. So Shui Bai, this is the mind map that they used to control the traffic and the infection control in their unit. And as of the publication of this article, after a year of, they had not a single case of hospital-acquired COVID, either in their patients or their staff. And so we included this as a supplemental file, and then the next slide shows the original. That's how it looked like when they first developed it. So in the final version of the published article on on our website. The Chinese version comes first because it was temporally first, and then the English version is considered secondary to that. So this is a way to show people, and anyone all over the world who looks at this who has Chinese. I think this is Mandarin. I have to say, I'm showing my ignorance. I don't know if it is Cantonese or Mandarin, but in any case, whoever can read this can see exactly what it says. Okay, then the next slide. This is they had a 54-page, I think, instruction booklet that was given to families who were taking their loved ones home. And many people on trach vent have gastrostomies. So the language is Persian, but the illustrations are universal and timeless. And all of our readers can profit from seeing this booklet. And the whole booklet was published as a supplemental file with the regular one. Then the following slide shows, it's a little bit, that's why I'm glad that Kathy can send you out this whole slide thing, because this is an example of how you can show narrative data in other languages in the report on the top is Arabic and then down below is Spanish. And one of the little points I'd like to point out about this, Hans de Ruyter, who is, I think a lot of us know him, is from the Netherlands. And he told us that in the Dutch language, there isn't a word that is an equivalent to our word of anxiety. They have a word for fear that matches fear and a word that matches stress. But when he talks to his Dutch friends about anxiety, there isn't a word for it. So if anyone, oh yeah, Rachel saw Hans today. So, and I hope I'm quoting him correctly. I think I am because I verified it with him. So if anybody publishes an article about Dutch nurses and their experiences, let's say during the pandemic, and they have this narrative qualitative data, and they generate a theme that includes the word anxiety, well, so scholarly discourse would enable Hans or me or know that you know about it to contact those authors and say, can we talk? So that's one of the things that you can do with this publishing in multiple languages.
So the question is next steps, right? This was a huge, huge project. And as we described the process, we were kind of following what we could with our resources and what we had available to do this in the most respectful way in order to generate something that really has rarely been done. When we discussed this at MNORN during our conference last year, we had heard from other nurse editors where they are publishing in the languages that people are writing their scholarship. However, they're not going through this multilingual publication of actively translating and retro-translating to confirm and then publishing both. So really this method is very rare in that. And so our next steps is looking at, will our model and the work that we do or we did, if we share this more broadly, can we start challenging that narrative that one language is the dominant language of scholarship and get information out to those communities that would benefit more broadly from the work that's happening? And while I understand the scholarship itself may not apply to your specific settings, we hope that as you listen to this work, that you can think about the theories that we've talked about and see that translated into your own settings, whether it be, we're constantly sending out patient information in English to our Spanish-speaking populations, or, do we have ways in which people can access information in their dominant language? And if not, why? And what if? Right? And so here's the theory, but really that next step is not only developing the model so that we have that theory, but then looking at what does this look like in our world, in the publication world, and what does that look like in practice? And Marty can talk to that.
I'm looking back. So in practice, the things that we are doing with both of the journals I work with is looking for more opportunities to do exactly what we did with this too, to refine the model and get this stuff out there. And then looking for opportunities. The other journal, Creative Nursing, we wouldn't be able to do what we did with this article. We just wouldn't, but we can incorporate this stuff in multiple languages. But if you're asking yourselves, what can I do if you aren't on the board of a journal? I look back and Rachel said, I always feel bad excluding articles because they are not in English. So I would have to say, why are you excluding them? It's at least partly your call of whether or not to exclude them. And if you're excluding them because they are, you don't feel like they're rigorous enough, that's great. But if you're excluding them only because they aren't in English, that's your call. The third thing is something that we all can work on, which is to challenge the predominance of English in gathering and presenting data. And one way to do this that we all can support in any capacities that we have is participatory action research. It was mentioned briefly in one of the other slides. Participatory action research is a thing. And at the end of this PowerPoint, you'll find a 2-page reference list. We call that a resource list because it's more than just a reference list. It has resources that aren't necessarily mentioned in here. But one of them is by Christiante Effendi and her colleagues, and it's about participatory action research. It's a review, but it's a wonderful introduction to how research can be conducted respectfully, inclusively, and in making use of all the talents that study participants bring to the process. And in one way, it's a coincidence, and it's another way, it's not. We published this in Creative Nursing several years ago, and Dr. Effendi and her colleagues are from Indonesia.
And so with that, I know we're past by a couple minutes. We do welcome your comments or questions. Please note we're also open to connecting with you by email if you're curious more about our process or curious about next steps, or perhaps even how to translate this work into your own settings. I think I'm gonna put this in the chat.
Can you also, my last name is hyphenated. It's Lewis
Oh,
hyphen.
sorry.
Yeah, my last name starts with an L, not an H.
There you go. Any questions or comments?
There's a comment that says, in my work on multicultural care, I needed to use several articles that were not in English. And that's great that you did.
Yeah, this is definitely a critical topic, and as all of us navigated COVID, right? There were things that people were learning around the world that we would benefit from if we could have that information available to us in our own language, but also if we have that knowledge to do our due diligence to share that in a meaningful way for other people to receive it in their own language.
It made me just think about the work we're doing on DEI and other things, and how just how we use language, and and those biases that we have, whether we're publishing or not. And this is a way of looking at that in a way that seems really meaningful.
Yeah, and it was so interesting in the literature review that we were doing that really bias and stereotype and your stereotype in which your belief system is really came forward in one of the models, and the model was really around what to do before you get into the translation process rather than how to address this throughout the translation process, because things that you can evaluate your biases and your stereotypes, but you have to keep doing that work, right? You can't just do it at the beginning of the project and think, I'm good, I'm done. But really it's a constant, it's a constant check on yourself and be able to do that within your teams as well.
You have a little boy popping up
I
behind
did. Yeah, they just got home.
you. He's cute. Yeah, I'll be sending this on to, I'll send the recording and the PowerPoint to A&A staff that's working on some of the bias work.
Yeah.
Because I think it just kind of offers it in a different dimension.
Yeah, and if this work is really interesting to you and you want to keep learning about what we did, I'll be publishing this in a book, a chapter all around what is the model and how did this start from a question of what if. And then Marty and I are going to be also publishing a journal article on this process and how the partnership threads existed throughout this work in the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, with the hope of it being published in the fall. So that's sort of our next steps as well in getting this information out to people and hopefully a way that's meaningful to them.
There's a comment, a wonderful comment in the chat from Christy about how we shouldn't, in patient education, we shouldn't assume that people can read the languages that they speak. And that the whole thing about health literacy is true in any language. But I wanted to mention an article that we published in Creative Nursing like 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a study about people. There's a people in Dallas. There's a whole community of Ethiopian expatriates who live in Dallas. And so this was a study of whether these people would want to have health education in Ethiopian or in English, because the sort of the assumption would be, oh, they're from Ethiopia, so they would like to have their, these are people in their 50s and 60s and 70s. Well, it turns out that because of the history of colonialism in Ethiopia, the people in that generation, English was imposed. They were speaking English from the time they were in kindergarten. So for them, they didn't have a preference for having it in Ethiopian, whereas newer generations of immigrants from Ethiopia to the United States, it might be different. But it just goes to show that, as Christy said, you can't make assumptions about language and what people want and what they need. You have to find out, you have to do participatory action research and find out what it really is on the ground.
Well, I worked with an Ethiopian nurse who he would have said Italian would have been the language he'd wanted in, but he also spoke Ethiopian, Italian, Russian, German, and English, and we used him in most every room that we needed a translator.
Yeah.
He knew more languages than any of us. He was great.
If I ruled the world, we would never say ESL, English as a second language, because so many. Atisham Yunus speaks 6 languages.
Yeah. I speak 2, English and nursing.
Isn't that the truth?
Well, thank you so much. This has just been fascinating, and I'm really grateful that the 2 of you could come and talk to us tonight. And I'll be sending out a survey to the attendees and for an evaluation. And then when I get that back, you'll get a certificate of attendance. And I see you've got a thumbs up from Mary and Epsilon, and I think there's thumbs up all around. So thank you so very much for the work you're doing and for telling us about it tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. Again, not only to share our story, which is complex and kind of niche, but hopefully you saw or were able to translate our work into your own settings. But also just to MNORN, a thank you for making this even a possibility for me to travel to Ireland and be able to share this story with Marty. Because without the financial support, I'm not sure that our family would have been able to make that happen. So these are the ways where $500 may not seem like a lot, but it really is it's meaningful and it supports scholars to get their voice out, get their word out, and share those stories. So thank you very, very much.
I think you're the first person who asked for a stipend, so. And you're
Well,
not the
there
last.
Yep,
You
let's
gotta
not make
keep
it the last. Let's
Right,
keep
right.
it going.
Well, and
Thank you all so much for your attention. Marty?
just for fun, inane, if the world goes as it should, inane is going to meet in Minneapolis next year.
Ah,
So yeah,
good.
so anyone who's interested in nursing publication can join inane for free and consider it. Anyway, just thought I'd mention that. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.
Good night.